it's some weird quirk in the schedule that we're making up. I don't know if it's Good Friday classes being made up on a Tuesday, which seems very odd. I don't remember that we've ever done that before. But in any case, that means that, this is our penultimate lecture, and we will be together one last time on Thursday. And I know you've heard from your teaching fellows already, but just to add to what I said about the final exam last time, threw out some sort of ideas about what the essay questions might look like, but we would love to have you contribute to that process, and we think that that is also the best way, one of the best ways for you to prepare for the final exam is to actually be thinking about what kinds of synthetic questions might pull material together from across the class. So you are being asked, invited to contribute questions, and then that will be at least part of the focus of conversation in section next week in preparation for the final exam. So I will still send out a message that just kind of summarizes, like, this is the format of the exam and so on. But I hope that that will be an enjoyable and fruitful process for you. All right, so I was thrilled last time when Kate and her discussion group asked to reflect on points of tension between sort of ecocentric approaches and eco-justice approaches to thinking about climate and environment and so on, brought up issues surrounding food because it provides the perfect segue to our topic for today. And in fact, I mean, it isn't an accident that I put food where I did, after that conversation. So, I mean, where to begin when thinking about food, thinking ethically about food? If Christian ethics is a matter of reflecting on how to live in response to what God has done, is doing in creating and redeeming and consummating the world, then how is food to be understood in relationship to all of this? And how do we think of food in relationship, say, to scripture, to tradition, to reason, and to experience? I mean, part of what I want to make sure sinks in, right, as a result of this class is the fact that any aspect of life can become a site for ethical reflection. How it doesn't have to stick out as, oh, this is a problem that has to be solved, or oh, this is a case study that we have to dive into. Any aspect of life. It can be a matter of taking something that's normally unexamined and reflecting on it. How do we live well in relationship to this particular domain of existence? How do we become reflective, perhaps in an area that we haven't been reflective? How should we even begin to describe this terrain of life and become more aware of how we're describing it, right? And how does our description enable us to perceive certain things and perhaps block us from perceiving other things about it? And I wanted a balance in this course of topics that have had a kind of classical place in Christian ethics, where it's very easy to go back centuries and find a source that reflects ethically on it, and topics that have kind of surfaced more recently as sites for ethical reflection, and food ethics is one of these. So it's sort of a hot topic right now, and looking at it in part allows us to think about how something becomes a site for ethical reflection. So what is going on when we think about food? Well, obviously we eat. We eat like all other animals. We have to eat in order to survive. We have to think about food at least enough in order to get some of it and to consume it in order to survive. But food is so much more than that, right? Food is freighted with so many meanings. And that is the case is indicated by the way in which there are so many rituals that surround food. And food and its consumption is regulated in so many different ways in Christianity and indeed in all religions of which we're familiar. All traditions regulate the consumption of food, have rituals surrounding food, and food, therefore, it's not surprising to find, is threaded through Scripture from the very beginning to the very end, from God giving plants yielding seed and trees yielding fruit as foods for the first humans, giving green plants as food to the beasts of the earth, a vegetarian vision for creation in Genesis. Reaching all the way to the 12 kinds of fruit on the tree of life in the New Jerusalem in the final chapter of Revelation. So literally from the beginning to the end of Christian scripture. And Jesus eating in the Gospels is highlighted again and again, from his habits of eating with tax collectors and sinners, his multiplication of loaves and fishes, the Last Supper with his disciples, post-resurrection fish roasts on the beach. Food appears in the New Testament in relationship to planting, to harvesting, to famine, to feast, to sacrifice, to offering. So if we begin with de la Torre, with what is going on, there is so much going on just in Christian sources. Well, what about what's going on in the world in relationship to food? Well, like many things, food looks different depending on your social location, depending on your economic location. For many, the problem is too much food, too much cheap food. There are huge amounts of food waste in this country. So much eating in restaurants, so much food left over. But of course, for others, the problem is lack of food, or the problem is lack of key nutrients. So let's, think about some data here, some data and some definitions to help us think about food. So food security. Food security relates to food availability, access, and utilization. When a person always has adequate availability and access to enough safe and nutritious food to maintain an active and healthy life, they're considered food secure. So always has adequate access, not just to any food, to safe and nutritious food. That is food security. Hunger. Hunger is lack of food, distress associated with lack of food. And how do we define lack of food? Well, there are many different ways, but the threshold that's been designated for undernourishment is fewer than 1,800 calories a day. So we pick a kind of arbitrary number so that we can measure, so that we can gather data, right? So that we can then wrap our minds around an issue. Undernutrition. Undernutrition is not just lack of calories, not just insufficient calories. It also signifies nutrition that is deficient in energy and protein and essential vitamins and minerals. And malnutrition is a broader term. It refers both to undernutrition and to overnutrition, to unbalanced diets, to diets that have the wrong mixture of protein, vitamins, minerals, etc. And world food insecurity and hunger are on the rise. They're on the rise. I don't have the most updated data, but nearly 10% of the world's population were undernourished in 2019. And that was 60 million more than 2014, which is kind of a shock because there has been so many efforts to address world hunger, and it had been declining, but it is now increasing again. And 21% of the children in the world are stunted in growth because of chronic malnutrition. So why this increase? Why this reverse? Well, many conflicts around the world, climate-related instabilities, COVID was another shock. The problem, though, is not lack of food production. It's not fundamentally about not having enough food out there in the world. It's much more about food distribution, the way in which food is distributed around the world. 19% of the population in the African continent is undernourished, and that is rising. And in North America and Europe, 88 million people experience moderate or severe food insecurity. That's staggering numbers. And there are gender gaps here, there are age gaps here. More women than men experience food insecurity, more children than adults experience food insecurity. And two, overnutrition is on the rise globally as well, in all regions. Outside of Asia, only in upper middle income nations are enough fruits and vegetables available to meet recommendations. So dietary diversity is very low in most regions of the world. And the cost of a healthy diet with the right mixture of nutrients is 60% higher than the cost of a nutrient adequate diet, just like enough. And 5 times the cost of an energy sufficient diet, enough calories. 5 times the cost. So most of the poor around the world can't afford an energy sufficient diet. They can afford to get enough calories, but they can't afford a nutrient adequate diet. In this country, 41 million Americans are food insecure. They have problems getting food. They have a shortage of food in the house, or they have reduced food intake on a perhaps an irregular basis, and that is 1 in 8 U.S. families. And the topic of food deserts came up last time. Food deserts, 12.8% of the U.S. population live in food deserts. The supermarket is far away. There's no convenient public transportation to get you to the supermarket, and so you rely on fast food. You rely on convenience stores. And this is an issue that disproportionately affects people of color and people living in underserved neighborhoods, people living in poverty. So as globally, a healthy diet costs more, much more. And food is a signal of social privilege and status. Who can afford to eat locally sourced food? Who can afford to eat fresh food? Who can afford to eat a nutritionally balanced vegetarian diet or a vegan diet? And all of these issues, of course, have huge impact on healthcare costs. They also have huge impacts on the state of the environment and climate change. Food systems contribute 21 to 30% of greenhouse gas emissions. And consuming fewer animal source foods could dramatically reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So data, right? Data, facts. What to do? Well, of course, all sorts of policy puzzles loom, and therefore political issues and political conflict surrounding these issues. Which foods are taxed? Which foods are subsidized? Is, for instance, a dairy subsidy a good thing because we all need calcium? Or is it a bad thing given the amounts of methane that cows produce? Should we be focused on increasing productivity? Should we be focused on decreasing crop losses pre-harvest or post-harvest? Should we increase diversification of crops, improve transportation structures, set trade policies with nutrition in view? Should we improve our capacity to preserve food? These are just some, right? Some of the policy questions that surround food and its distribution. And there are the usual problems with humanitarianism that crop up here when we think about global food issues. The wealthy West swooping in with diagnoses and solutions, operating according to neo-colonialist structures. For decades now, of course, aid agencies have, of course, tried to shift to models that empower local agency rather than depriving people of agency. There are more collaborative models that exist, but bottom line is the wealthy West eats in ways that burden the globe. All right, so I've thrown various data at you, definitions, facts. What does Christian ethics bring to the table? Where to begin I mean, there's some obvious things here, right? Everyone should have enough healthy food to eat. But is there something distinctive? Are there some things that are distinctive about what Christian ethics might bring to the table in reflecting about food? So I want to throw that open for a minute, realizing that there might not be like an immediate answer, but what ideas do you have? Does Christianity contribute by bringing forward people who care? Is it about caring about the issues, being motivated, working out of a tradition that has always tried to feed the hungry, right? Going back to those works of mercy? Henry.
Yeah, I was going to say something along the same lines of like liberation theology. I think that Christianity can offer a perspective that specifically centers the marginalized and like the underprivileged. And I suppose maybe a lot of different ethical sources could claim to do the same thing, but Christianity, that is kind of the core of Christian ethics is centering the voices of those who are in need.
So who do you attend to? Where do you look first? What do you see from that vantage point? And then working accordingly. Katie.
Yeah, I think one of the things that Christian contextualism in particular, or Christian virtue ethics brings to the table is that a lot of that particular stream of Christian thought has been formed around crafting solutions or crafting ethical action in ways that are incredibly responsive to the context of a place. And I think hunger and food insecurity is one of those, what they call them, wicked problems, where the solution is not going to be just one thing, and it's especially not going to be just one thing in every single place. And so I think the deep contextualism of one of the major streams of Christian thought matters a lot to this particular kind of problem. Famous for climate change.
Yep, I'm glad you brought in wicked problems again, because there's, as I was talking about how, production issues, distribution issues relate to policy issues, you start to get the sense that, oh yes, this is another wicked problem, right? And there are going to be many unintended consequences of whatever we do. And so thinking very deeply about context, critical. Yeah. Any other thoughts surface? Yeah.
Just like a basic thing that's a part of kind of the gospel imagination is like reevaluating what you actually need. And I think part of the Christian tradition can help us re-interrogate what we consume, and when we go out to the road, are we just taking our sandals, or are we taking, a big tailgate setup for us to go and march along? So there's just sort of, resources for re-interrogating how much we're using, and whether we could actually maybe live more fruitful, happier lives if we learn to filter some of that away.
Yeah. What is it that we really need, and how do we go about deciding that, right? Taking a perspective that is trying to be kind of all-encompassing while being attentive to where we're situated within that grand vision, right? I'm right here now in this particular location, but what is happening in creation as such? What is God doing in creation as such? Yeah, so I think the readings that we have for today are both Christian ethicists who are trying to get us to see the realities in different ways, helping us to describe the realities in different ways. That will lead us to feel differently, respond differently. So we're in conversation today with Norman Wirzba and Rachel Muers. They offer us points of entry. They're very similar in their methodologies, and yet you could see them in conflict in some very interesting ways, so I hope we can reflect on that. And Rachel Muers, too, is helpful as we're getting to the very end of the semester, because she's not just reflecting on food, on sharing tables and so on, but she's also really very self-conscious about thinking about this as methodology in Christian ethics. So she wants to think about multiple layers here of reflection, and we want to as well. So what's this commonality of methodology in these two thinkers? Both are interested in thinking about how Christian practices, like the Eucharist, like saying grace, practices shape perception, shape our understanding of the world, shape the meaning of our actions. So the actions that we do differ according to how we understand them, how we describe them. And that reflects a basic turn to practices in Christian theology and Christian ethics over the past several decades. So Norman Wirzba is on the faculty of Duke Divinity School. We're reading from a book from 2011, Food and Faith, A Theology of Eating. He's written a number of very significant books in this kind of broad terrain. And he's trying, in this particular book, to provide a comprehensive theological framework for assessing eating's significance. And in the book as a whole, he does various things. He does evaluate food production systems. He evaluates consumption practices. He looks at today's industrial food systems. So he does a lot of things. Obviously, he's not doing all of those things in this particular chapter. He's asking, as he does this, how eating can care for human creatures, for non-human creatures, and how it can honor God. So, thinking about eating in relationship to other creatures, human creatures, and God. And most fundamentally, he thinks we fail to appreciate both the theological and the ethical significance of eating unless we see the sacramental character of eating and orient ourselves to eating by reflecting on the Eucharist. So you might not think, oh, this is how we do Christian ethics, by thinking about liturgy. But that's the claim, right? The claim is we have to think about the sacramental character of eating. Now, in this particular chapter, he's reflecting on food in relationship to the practice of saying grace. And saying grace is not a sacrament per se, right? But he wants to think very broadly about eating as having a sacramental character. And saying grace is a Christian practice that Thanksgiving is woven into Christian liturgy. And this is the primary site for doing theology and for doing ethics, the life of worship. Lex orandi, lex credendi, you may have heard this at various points. The law of belief and doctrine follows or flows from the law of prayer. What are we doing in prayer? That's the primary site of what it is we believe, what our faith is constituted by. So what we tend to think of as theology is theology that's removed from the life of the church, and it will become dead and lifeless unless it's fed in an ongoing way by these practices. So this is a form of theologizing that undermines any distinction between theology and ethics, and it undermines any distinction between systematic theology and practical theology, sees all of these as artificial distinctions that get in the way of good theologizing in connection with the life of the church, its worship, and its other practices. So what about saying grace? Saying grace, the practice of thanksgiving, Wirzba argues, identifies people as creatures who don't just ingest food, don't just digest food, but relish food as a medium of life and love. In saying grace, food is experienced as the manifestation of God's abounding and incomprehensible love. So we experience food fundamentally differently when we experience it through the practice of thanksgiving. So if Christian ethics is about responding to who God is and what God is doing, then saying grace enables people's perceptive and receptive faculties to be renewed so that the world and its creatures are met as the place of God's communion with creation. Eating together, sharing food, is a symbolically freighted site of community, of communion, of coming together. We don't always eat together. Sometimes we eat alone, but even when we eat alone, the food that we're eating is still symbolically freighted as a site of communion. And when we say grace, this is expanded in awareness of communion with God and with all of creation, not just with those who are sitting potentially at a table with us. It's communion with God and creation. And this can be an eschatological anticipation. It can be a taste of paradise, a site of full, abundant communion. So we hunger. And what we hunger for most fundamentally, he argues, is not food, it's not calories, it's not nutrition. We fundamentally hunger for communion, for connectedness. And as we hunger and as we consume, we may or may not realize it, but nothing in creation can fully satisfy this hunger, because everything that we eat points beyond itself to its source in creation, but ultimately its source in God, its creator. And in saying grace, we acknowledge this. We acknowledge where our food comes from most ultimately. We acknowledge not just where food comes from, but we acknowledge that only God can finally assuage our hunger. Only God, the source of all life. This doesn't mean turning away from creation to the Creator. Wirzba argues we have to move through, not around creation, to its Creator. And that eating well can be a way of doing so. Eating well is a way of acknowledging that God assuages our hunger, that God is the site of full communion. So how do we eat well if eating well is so critical? Well, if we're going to give thanks, we must be able to experience food as worthy of gratitude, as worthy of grace, giving thanks, not just as stuff, not just as fuel, not just as commodity. And he thinks that this is impeded by not knowing where food products come from, not knowing how they are processed. It's impeded in a different way by watching cooking shows rather than cooking, consuming spectacle. It's impeded by fast food, which does not encourage contemplation. It's an industrial product. Ingredients are chosen because they can be efficiently grown, readily manipulated, easily transported, mindlessly prepared. So he points us to the slow food movement, which hopes to encourage people to care about food, and not just care about food, but care about the ecosystems, care about the animals, the farming, the cooking cultures that make food possible. And you may be wondering if he's buying into various problematic classist sets of assumptions here, and he does try to grapple with the question of whether this is just a highbrow, high-income movement, and suggests that at its best, what defenders of the slow food movement say is that they're really after the preservation of communal habits that are all about coming together in communion in the sight of food. Habits that elevate care and conviviality over the destruction and alienation produced by fast food cultures. Elevating habits that have been central to indigenous cultures and peasant populations around the world, which maybe raises another worry that there's a romanticization of indigenous and peasant populations, most of which are now suffering from tremendous food insecurity and do not have the luxury of cultivating something like a slow food movement. So there's a lot of complexity here. And I don't mean to suggest that he denies it, but he's trying to find sites of promise here. The right of healthy food and clean water for everyone needs to be affirmed, but it also, he thinks, needs to be held together with the pleasures of eating together. We don't move forward on the question of food only by thinking about delivering the right calories and the right packages to the hungry mouths. We have to also recognize that for everyone, no matter their resources, no matter their degree of privilege, the pleasure of eating together needs to be honored. And not only the pleasure of human communion and eating, but also an acknowledgement of the ways in which food and food production are bound up with ecosystem processes. Well, how do we fit into the broader ecosystems out of which our food comes? How can that be honored in eating well? So the aspiration that he articulates is to eat Eucharistically. What does it mean to eat Eucharistically? It's to cherish God's gifts, right? To eat and encounter what one is eating as gift from God, and to encounter God in this eating. And this is partly about encountering God and those with whom we sit at the table. It's also about acknowledging our dependence on our fellow creatures, those fellow creatures that we eat. We cannot live without consuming other creatures. Maybe not animal creatures, but plant creatures at least, right? Something has to be eaten. And acknowledging this dependence in a way, he says, that acknowledges their value, that their value is not reduced to their contribution to our diet. So we want to acknowledge their worth, their independent worth. So how do we eat Eucharistically? What does it mean to acknowledge the worth of what we eat? Well, we might turn that question around a little bit and ask, how do we become worthy of the food that we eat? Worthy of the life and death that our eating requires? Well, in a very fundamental sense, he thinks we become worthy by giving thanks. But he thinks that giving thanks does not stop at offering up grace. It doesn't stop at having thoughts in one's head about God being the ultimate source of the food. It requires a lot more. It requires acknowledging the human workers that have been involved in growing and harvesting the food, and attending to who those workers are. Often in our country, migrant workers, underpaid, exploited. Acknowledging then the brokenness of our eating, and seeking an understanding of a kind of interdependent wholeness for which we long. How could this interconnectedness of our lives with the lives of other creatures, both those we eat and those who prepare the food, how could that become a site of wholeness and not a site of brokenness? We're invited to turn our lives into gifts of nurture that by sharing extend rather than deplete our common life. So coming together to be fed in order to be able to feed others, to extend God's self-offering by way of our own self-offering. And he thinks that turning our lives into gifts of nurture will lead us to ask, in a very holistic, contextual way about the health and flourishing of soil and water and plants and animals and equitable food distribution and deprivation and working conditions. So eating as a sacramental act leads us into all of this complexity, but it leads us into this complexity in a way that he thinks remains Eucharistic, remains rooted in this awareness of all that we have as gift from God. So eating as a sacramental act is not about adding some like religious sort of religious coding on what we're doing, but rather it's an unveiling of the divine loveliness that's already at work in all of these things and that is being broken and contaminated by the ways in which we are engaging in food and eating. So we have here in Wirzba an attempt to have our ethical reflection on food be deeply rooted in our reflection on Christian practices, Christian worship, Christian understanding of the world. And we could say he sees a kind of solution there, right? So the brokenness of the way we eat, of our food production, and so on. And there's a solution that is found by turning to Christian practices. Well, let's see how Rachel Muers' approach is both similar to and different from that of Wirzba. Rachel Muers, this is the piece that we're reading is from a book on everyday ethics, moral theology, and the practices of ordinary life. So the idea here was to look at practices theologically. So it's still, in that sense, again, methodologically very closely connected to what we see in Wirzba. And she's trying in this piece to focus on food sharing. And food sharing as something that happens universally across cultures. It's certainly a central Christian practice, food sharing, Eucharistic, sacrament, absolutely central. But she is trying to situate that Christian theological reflection on that particular kind of food sharing with cultural variation around the world. And she thinks that food and food sharing need to be seen as sites of conflict and tension and not just as sites of communion. They're sites of conflict and tension because they carry so many meanings. So, for instance, in many cultures, there's an obligation to distribute food, not equally to everyone. No, you distribute food in ways that affirm social hierarchies that exist. Certain people get the best part of the food, or they get more food, and that reaffirms the social hierarchies. They might honor guests, it might do various things. So we have to attend to how food practices, how specific forms of food sharing work or function socially. There's a sense in which one has to share food, not just to keep the body alive, but to keep the social body alive. And the social body keeps us alive in significant ways. So we might identify a host of injustices that permeate our social practices of food sharing. And that raises the question of how we can protest against those injustices without rejecting the social order itself. It's a kind of threat to the social order in challenging some aspects of the ways in which food is shared. Protesting against the givens of food sharing will be read as a rejection of social solidarity. How do you affirm social solidarity? How do you affirm that you're seeking a better form of social solidarity as you protest against existing food sharing practices? And how can you navigate all of these sites of conflict and tension around food sharing Christianly? Well, she thinks one thing that is not the solution here is simply to identify distinctively Christian food practices and to hold them up and to say, this is the solution. So this is where she might be a little bit suspicious of what Wirzba is doing as too idealizing. Like, let's just go to the Eucharist and then we'll see, okay, that's our solution. The danger is that you'll find some distinctively Christian food practices and you might perhaps lift them up in contrast with practices of secular modernity. So we've got a good Christian past that's sort of been lost, and we need to recover it, and we're going to do that by finding those practices. And there might be some nostalgia attached to that about pre-modern harmony. We're going to recover that harmony. And this is a temptation into which theological ethics falls. So Muers is calling for something that still is looking to Christian practices and food practices, but is trying not to be nostalgic, trying not to be overly idealizing in doing this. So how do we avoid that pitfall? She suggests look at the ethical questions that arise when someone tries to do food sharing differently, or someone tries to bring together different food practices or different patterns of sharing. So look at points of change, look at points of innovation, and think about what are the tensions that arise when these things happen. Focus on boundaries, focus on joining points. Focus on differing food practices of different communities and what happens when they come together. And she appeals here explicitly on Willie Jennings' notion of joining social bodies across places and cultures. So, differing food practices, we might think about asceticism as a very different set of food practices. And we might think about asceticism as deeply rooted in Christian traditions. And there is a new ascetic movement today. And I don't think she's so much saying, oh, this is problematic because it nostalgically reaches back into the Christian past. But she does want us to think about it very carefully, because asceticism can slip into suspicion or denigration of embodiment per se. And what that can do is to also lead into denigrating people or groups who don't adequately overcome the limitations of their food practices or their bodies. So asceticism becomes the elite form of Christian expression, and those who fail to embrace the right kind of fasting are not good Christians. But perhaps asceticism can also be a form of advocating a relationship to food that recovers the body's flourishing, that corrects social and cultural malformations of eating. So let's think in a complicated way about some of the past and present practices with regard to food, and try to think about how they function socially in complex ways. Well, what about the Eucharist? What about turning to the Eucharist as a site for renovating our food sharing practices? The worry that she articulates here is that we will lift it up as a radically inclusive, hierarchy-inverting shared meal, that we will lift it up as, say, the answer to modernity's eating disorders, and I think she means eating disorders in the broadest sense here, carries a risk of isolating Eucharistic eating. So when we come together in the Eucharist, that is when we eat well, setting it up in contrast to everyday food practices. So it just becomes this time and place set apart when all is well with our eating here. And it doesn't transform anything about our eating practices elsewhere. So what we need to do is to attend to the reciprocal relationships between the Eucharist and its social context, including its context of food practices, asking, is it transformative of everyday social contexts? What hierarchies might it be setting up between, say, the Christian and the non-Christian, between the ecclesial and the everyday? And how do we address the hierarchies that it introduces, even as it perhaps is claiming to undo hierarchies and be a site of ideal communion? So food sharing is not distinctively Christian. It's not even distinctively human. Food sharing is found in many other social animal species. And across species that engage in food sharing provides opportunities for many things. For joining, but also for excluding, also for hierarchy building, also for othering. Like, who gets the food and who doesn't get the food? Because it's a very important thing. So how can we create in encounters across food sharing practices spaces for attentive encounter marked by generosity and vulnerability? One of the sites she looks for in reflecting on this set of questions is Romans 14. This Romans 14 is where Paul is reflecting on the strong and the weak in relationship to eating meat sacrificed to idols, and insisting that we must not adopt the perspective of the strong, those who disregard the significance of socially established food practices, those who insist it really doesn't matter whether you eat food sacrificed to idols because they're idols after all. Instead, we should prioritize the weaker parts to make difference a basis of solidarity. What does that mean then in our context? We need to understand the reasonableness of others' practices and not pass hasty judgment on them, on whether they're gung-ho for slow food or gung-ho for the new asceticism. Or, since judgment cannot be avoided, how do we make judgments that serve the shared task of walking in love? How can we join together different practices in a way that builds communion? Clearly, the practices of the communities to which Paul was writing didn't do this. Some were left hungry. There's inequality. So we see in these early Christian communities not an idealized eating well rooted in the Eucharist. We see the Eucharist as a site for conflict, for disunion. What can we learn from that? What can we learn from the constant ongoing brokenness that the Eucharist is not the full eschatological anticipation that we might hope it to be, but it itself remains broken. It's not just that everyday food practices remain broken, but our sacramental food practices remain broken as well. Both Muers and Wirzba share this hope that reflecting on Christian eating practices, sacramental eating practices, can flow out into our everyday practices in various ways, even if Muers is maybe more concerned about the danger of idealizing than Wirzba is. They both are deeply committed to having it inform the everyday. Muers gives an example. These always fall short because they always seem so anecdotal. So she gives the example of the Real Junk Food Project, which is one of these projects that tries to salvage food that would otherwise be thrown away and to share it. So what does this do? Well, this re-signifies food as primarily for sharing, not primarily for profit. So re-signifies food. You see the same sort of effort as we saw in Wirzba of what is the meaning of food, and how do our encounters with food in a daily way give food new meaning, give food different layers of meaning, even if we're not solving a structural problem. So as we concluded our class last time, we were talking about Laudato Si and the way in which Pope Francis articulates many different levels at which we need to be addressing climate crisis. It's not just, either we're going to work for systemic change, or we're going to think about what we can do in our neighborhood, or we're going to be understanding this all sacramentally, all thoroughly theologically. It is happening at all of these levels simultaneously. And I believe that we are seeing the same sort of effort here in Muers and Wirzba, an insistence that we're not going to bring anything to the table if we work at only one of these levels. So the question was, all right, we get all the data, we get a handle on some of the issues that surround food. And then we ask, well, what does Christian ethics bring to the table? In a way that's the wrong order in which to move. Or maybe another way to put it is, just remember that we're always within the hermeneutical circle. So which facts will we gather? What will we think is worth attending to? What will we even see as an issue or not see as an issue? That will depend on the lens that we bring to bear when we look out there at the world. So Wirzba and Muers are trying to give us a lens that might enable us to ask different questions, might enable us to see different facts, find new descriptions, and then that will transform our ways of relating to food, to eating, to communion, and indeed to everything. Thank you very much, folks, and see you next Thursday and not next Tuesday.